Why are vampires so dang sexy these days? Hey nerd, happy Halloween! Welcome to the first installment of my ridiculous three-part series on vampires, where I got way too excited trying to analyze three of the most interesting aspects of these blood-sucking freaks. In this video, I'll be yapping at you about the use of vampires as a literary device, which writers have used for hundreds of years to hold a mirror up to society, and unpack certain behaviors and feelings within ourselves that we don't appreciate. My next video in the series will cover what makes a vampire, and I'll tell you a little bit about different vampire creatures from around the world. The final episode will be spent discussing actual real-life evidence that helps us understand the belief in vampires throughout history. Remember, if you like this, let me know, and I've got a Patreon that you can join to show your support. Let's bite into this. See, I'm funny. I'm a funny person that people like. So how in the world did vampires go from hunched, pale, naked mole rat type spazoids to the debonair and alluring characters that we see on TV today? Sexuality has become an overt selling point to attract audiences to vampire stories, and popular modern depictions like those of Twilight, Interview with a Vampire, and True Blood emphasize this while towing the line between exciting and scandalous from the perspective of mainstream viewers. Bram Stoker's Dracula was perhaps the first depiction of a vampire as being romantic, or sexy in some ways. Just about as soon as his novel was released, critics jumped on it to admonish the sexual nature of Stoker's imagined monster, and they really thought it was honestly gay. They thought Stoker and his vampire were gay as hell. Noting the effeminate habits of this version of a vampire, the elegant and flowery imagery and prose, and the way that the story told a deep romantic and tragic tale wrapped in monsters and horror, critics of the time were like, this ain't hetero. We don't like it. It ain't right. This is the start of the mainstream perception of vampires as a vehicle for drawing light to sexual deviance. But not just sex stuff. Vampires became a literary tool used to highlight cultural taboos regarding many aspects of human life: fear, violence, fear of control and manipulation, anything that polite society wouldn't discuss, but which is important and can be talked about through the use of vampires. Technically, Bram Stoker was not the first person to use vampires this way. He was just the most well known, and his Dracula is the most mainstream. There was a short novel called Carmilla, written by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, which was published 26 years before Dracula, and this story was actually the first, as far as I know, to harness this motif of sexual deviance. The tale of Carmilla is some spooky sapphic propaganda, and in my opinion, that makes it even more impactful than Dracula in regard to using sexual deviance as a way to hold up a mirror to society. In Carmilla, a mysterious woman arrives at the door of another woman. The enchanting guest then seduces and takes the homeowner as her prey. This is probably the first widespread depiction of a lady vampire, and it challenged the already existing narratives of vampires as being masculine, barbaric, and gnarly. This time, the vampire is a pretty lady. And she's also gay. That is a pretty big fuck you to society as a whole, especially considering it was published in 1872. Can you imagine the pearl clutching that ensued? The common depiction of vampires includes a man vampire seducing, capturing, and chugging the blood of a young female victim. This has been the most well-known image of vampires in the public conscience for hundreds of years at this point. This alone highlights the use of vampires as a way of criticizing, or at least drawing attention to, the predatory imbalance of power between men and women in society, especially when it comes to issues surrounding purity, sex, and dominance. Stories and images such as this serve a powerful purpose for people. By using fictitious creatures who exist only as fantasy, storytellers have a safe way to communicate serious and complicated topics. While some of us use these stories to normalize, well, some of us, Some use these stories to normalize their own predatory feelings and compulsions, allowing them to feel more comfortable in analyzing or harnessing the darker or traditionally harmful aspects of their own psyche. Others have used it to point out the harmful or disgusting nature of social structures or power dynamics that we're forced to adhere to in our day to day lives. By using fantasy as a vehicle for these conversations, there is less room for harsh judgment by the masses. And there's a sort of, I guess, fun way to bring people together and fuel these big conversations. So here, we see the dawn of the age of vampires as a vehicle for social commentary regarding taboo, cultural norms, and self expression. When it comes to folklore from a long time ago, vampires have served as tools to teach people the importance of purity, moral obligation, and adherence to social norms. For example, in old school Slavic beliefs, it was said that certain people were at greater risk of rising from the grave as a blood sucking monster. They didn't call them vampires, though, they called them strigoi, and I will talk about them in my next episode. Join me there later. People believed that if someone, for example, drank too much booze, or they stole, or they deviated from the social norms at all, really, then they were likely to become a vampire, or a strigoi, after their death. In this way, the OG vampire stories were a way to sort of threaten people into acting right. It helped keep people in line, following the rules, and upholding moral standards. Most people would prefer a peaceful afterlife, so it might not be worth it to risk becoming a vampire just for some debauchery now and then. If you've seen any of my Little Lore videos, this purpose of folklore comes up quite a lot. Many monster stories exist to keep people from straying too far from what their culture deems to be acceptable behavior. But vampires became something a lot more. While most other folkloric creatures sort of stagnated in their stories, vampires continued to evolve. By the time Carmilla was written, this entire OG concept was flipped on its head. Vampires turned into something quite the opposite. Rather than stories which say those who were thieves or drunkards in their life were the ones in danger of rising from their graves as bloodthirsty monsters, vampire stories now existed to tell people that it's okay if we're not perfect. It's okay if we want to do gay shit. And it's okay to take back your power if you've been manipulated or beaten down. This is why vampire stories are so popular among people who don't quite fit in with popular society. You know what I mean? Another powerful message that modern vampire stories share with us is the way that it highlights those nasty aspects of human life. Like I mentioned earlier, themes of sexual predation, mind control, and feeding on those who are weak or marginalized. Vampires are often used as an allegory, or even metaphor for the way that Western culture upholds similar predatory systems. Pedophilia, the subjugation of women, child abuse, bigotry, even lateral violence within marginalized communities, rigid gender conformity, really anything that fucking sucks about society can be and has been emphasized within modern vampire media. Using a blood-sucking folkloric monster to convey the brutality and harm, brutality and harm of these systems is a way to show the viewer or reader exactly how fucked up that shit is. Does this scene make you uncomfortable? Good! Because this is a terrible thing and people do it all the time, so maybe we can, try to stop it. Maybe. You picking up what I'm putting down? This is why I've always loved vampire stories. I think it's important to highlight the fact that it's okay to be weird. It's okay to be angry and afraid. It's also not okay to have to live in fear. And whether the vampires are painted as the protagonists of the story or not, when they prey upon children or take away someone's autonomy, that is not okay. And it's usually a big plot point in whatever story we're dealing with. And it shouldn't be okay in real life either. Despite my general love for vampires, I have to admit that a whole lot of modern writers do not do this well. Or perhaps people intentionally misuse them and exploit the legacy of vampirism. To discuss these cultural taboos, uh, one example that comes to mind is Anne Rice. While I haven't personally read anything written by her in full, I have recently become acutely aware of the controversy her work has stirred up over the years. She's the one who wrote Interview with a Vampire, if you didn't know. Uh, the way that she describes children's bodies and she puts them in adult situations is similar to the way other vampire storytellers have discussed the horrors of child abuse. However, she has been noted as describing these scenes with a level of perverse specificity that suggests she personally feels good about what she's writing. And there is a particular skill that good writers have, and that is the ability to discuss terrible things without outright describing the details. Allusion and suggestion are important because if you gleefully type out the details of something terrible happening, not only do you traumatize your readers, but you open yourself up to some pretty intense criticism. Many people will feel like you are not in fact admonishing this behavior, but are instead reveling in it. And I know that Anne Rice is not the only writer who may be guilty of this. It's sort of extra disgusting to use vampires to get away with sharing your fucked up fantasies now that we're thinking about how it has traditionally been used as a critique of such things. Girl misunderstood the assignment. Sex and gayness have stopped being such a dramatic rebellion against the mainstream, and perhaps this is what has pushed many writers to ramp up the vile behaviors of vampires in their stories. Just having two ladies kissing doesn't stir up as much outcry as it used to. So if you want to get that same effect today, you have to throw in some more explicit taboo. But simply adding children or extra violence to the sexual themes is missing the point. Back in the day, it was necessary to hold up a mirror to the bigotry against same-sex relationships, and it was important to give the queers some stories that allowed them to quietly experience a part of their inner lives in a world that demonizes them. It is not necessary to normalize and comfort people who like pedophilia. Holding up the mirror and admonishing it is important, but the way that you write it is going to determine which of those things the reader is going to take away from your story. There are many other prevalent social issues that can be discussed using vampires as a vehicle, and many are very important today and need to be emphasized in our media to spread messages of unity, hope, and rebellion against those systems. Many writers do this well. So you can see that vampires have been used to hold a mirror up to society, to show us those things about ourselves that are ugly, the evils that exist in this world and in ourselves. Acknowledging those real-life horrors is the first step in motivating ourselves to do something about it. Another use of these creatures in fiction, however, is to bring to life our internal struggles, the fights that we have in our heads about who we are versus who we're supposed to be. I mentioned earlier that one of those struggles has to do with sexuality. Vampires represent a sort of idol through which people can channel aspects of themselves that bring us shame or which isolate us from our communities. And although homosexuality is no longer quite so shameful in the eyes of general Western society, it's no longer the only internal struggle represented in these stories. Other questions of identity are highlighted using vampires. Take, for example, Angel from Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Bill Compton from True Blood. These guys are the quintessential self-loathing vampire in contemporary media. Both spend much of their screen time fighting with themselves as they try to come to terms with what they are versus who they are. The stories of Angel and Bill Compton focus on the conflict between nature and nurture, the dissonance that takes place within us as we fight to understand ourselves. If we were made into a monster, is it possible that we ever become anything else? And this is a question that a lot of people who've experienced trauma deal with on a daily basis. If we wish to be good, to love, how can we suppress and overcome those harmful negative parts of who we are, like our trauma responses, our triggers, those self-preservation habits that we have built up that turn us into jerks? Or perhaps, can we accept and even harness that darkness inside of us and use it to do good? Stories involving vampires like these two, while clearly soaked in metaphor, are designed to speak to those of us who struggle with our identities and find ourselves fighting to overcome the shittier parts of who we are. Have you realized that you've got a bad temper and you tend to hurt the people that you love? That's your vampire shit. You want to stop doing that? Your journey to healing and becoming less of an asshole is reflected in the story of Bill Compton, as he goes back and forth giving up on his aspirations to be a good person and his violent vampiric nature. Were you traumatized by a terrible, violent ex lover? And that makes you unable to open up and experience love now? That's your vampire shit. Like angels fight to be one of the good guys and to love and protect people despite the way it conflicts with his bloodthirsty nature, you're working on being a good person and healing, even if it feels very foreign to your busted ass heart. You see what I mean? They're relatable. If you use the metaphor thing. Ooh, there's a kitty outside. Okay. While vampires have served the important purpose of speaking on widespread societal issues, they've also become a vehicle for talking individuals through our personal struggles. These ridiculous, cheesy freaks on TV tend to offer a sort of guidance and comfort for many people who have a hard time balancing who they want to be with who they are. This is why these vampire movies and series develop such a cult following. People feel seen and inspired by these characters. In conclusion, while we, while we all love to make fun of vampires, they are actually really important. Crucial, even. And I know that this is the skin of a killer, Bella. But no matter how poorly written or doofy some versions of these stories may be, the stories themselves and those concepts that are inherent within them, deep under the surface, have served a major purpose in literature and media. From the individual to entire cultures, these series and stories are designed to make us think and make us feel. That's why no matter how bad they are, people love them. And that is also why the love of vampires seems to be immortal. Like I'll mention in later installments of this series, people have had vampires on the mind since just about the dawn of civilization, if not earlier. Although what a vampire is has changed and evolved over the centuries, their prevalence in our traditions and stories has never abated. We fear them, we envy them, we find camaraderie with them, and some people want to wear them like hats. You do you. No shame. Vampires are just part of life. I did do a whole lot of academic research on this, but I must admit that, like, most of what I've given ya is my personal opinion and things that I've gleaned over a lifetime of being a nerd. Of course, my sources will be cited here in a minute and down below, but this is something that I've thought a lot about pretty much my entire life. I read a lot of vampire books as a teenager, and I eventually wondered why I actually liked them. Because even then, I recognized that those books were just full of cringe, but I couldn't put them down. I've been wondering why myself and so many other people love them so much. First thing I realized long ago was that I like them because they represent some of those cringy feelings I had myself. I was a bit of an outcast in my youth, and on the most basic surface level, one thing that vampires are is outcasts. No matter why you feel like you're weird or unpopular as a youngin', it's nice to see a character who is also weird and unlikable, but is also like really cool and strong, right? Vampires are for the weirdos. Anne Rice might be a weirdo in the bad way, possibly, but she is one of the most notorious modern vampire writers today, and as she has said, the vampire is an outsider. He's the perfect metaphor for those things. He's someone who looks human and sounds human but is not a human, so he's always on the margins. But even beyond that, I think that most people who spend any time in therapy or any time self-reflecting and wondering about why they are how they are eventually comes into some level of internal conflict that can be mirrored in these vampire stories. And most importantly, they serve to remind us of the real darkness in the world, those very real systems of violence and oppression that exist within our societies. And we should remain aware of those things so that they don't continue unnoticed. And that's why vampires are cool and important. And if you liked this, click the button to let me know. Subscribe if you want more of my bullshit. I've got a master's degree in history and I'm a nerd for all things weird, so I use my formal education to talk informally about whatever strange, dark, or mysterious thing catches my fancy. I'd love it if you joined my Patreon, which you can even do for free. There you get personal updates, some insight into my process, and a chance to join in the conversation. My Patreon is linked below, and it's patreon.com/backalleyalchemist. I'll be back soon with my second vampire video, continuing my Halloween special. Next time, we'll have a bunch of different vampires and vampire like creatures from different cultures and different times through history. Later, nerd!